The morning sun cast long shadows across the airfield as Captain Sarah Mitchell walked toward her A-10 Thunderbolt II, her flight suit still damp with perspiration from the pre-flight briefing. The humid air of the forward operating base clung to everything like a wet blanket, and the distant sound of artillery echoed through the jungle canopy that surrounded their temporary home. Sarah had been flying combat missions for 8 months now, but something about today felt different. The intelligence reports were sketchy, communications with ground forces had been intermittent, and the weather forecast called for heavy cloud cover that would make visual identification nearly impossible. Her aircraft, affectionately nicknamed Warthog by pilots and ground crews alike, sat waiting on the tarmac like a sleeping giant. The A-10 was not a beautiful aircraft by conventional standards, with its straight wings, twin engines mounted high on the fuselage, and that massive GAU-8 cannon protruding from its nose like the business end of a medieval weapon. But, to Sarah, it represented something far more important than beauty. It was a lifeline for the soldiers fighting on the ground below, a guardian angel wrapped in titanium armor and bristling with weapons designed for one purpose: close air support. The mission briefing had been tense. A convoy of humanitarian supplies bound for a remote village had gone missing 3 days ago. Satellite imagery suggested the trucks had been ambushed somewhere along the winding jungle road that snaked through enemy territory. Intelligence indicated that survivors might still be alive, possibly taken prisoner by insurgent forces that had been increasingly active in the region. The area was known to be heavily defended, with surface-to-air missile sites and well-concealed anti-aircraft positions that had already claimed 2 aircraft in the past month. Sarah's squadron commander, Colonel Marcus Rodriguez, had pulled her aside after the briefing. His weathered face showed the strain of months of combat operations, and his voice carried the weight of responsibility that came with sending pilots into harm's way. He explained that she would be flying alone on this mission, a deviation from standard protocol that made her stomach tighten with apprehension. The other pilots were committed to a larger operation on the Eastern Front, and time was running out for any potential survivors from the convoy. As she conducted her pre-flight inspection, Sarah's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking each system and weapon with the methodical precision that had kept her alive through dozens of combat sorties. The aircraft was loaded with a mix of ordnance, Maverick missiles for precision strikes against hardened targets, cluster bombs for area suppression, and thousands of rounds of 30mm ammunition for the GAU-8 cannon. Each weapon represented a tool in her arsenal, carefully selected for the mission ahead. The ground crew chief, Staff Sergeant Mike Thompson, approached with the final maintenance report. His oil-stained hands and confident demeanor reflected years of experience keeping these war machines in fighting condition. He gave her a thumbs up and shouted over the engine noise from other aircraft, "She's ready to hunt, Captain. Bring her back in one piece." Sarah nodded, knowing that behind his casual words lay genuine concern for both pilot and aircraft. Climbing into the cockpit, Sarah settled into the familiar environment that had become her second home. The instrumentation surrounded her in a carefully organized chaos of switches, displays, and controls. She began the engine start sequence, listening to the distinctive whine of the twin turbofan engines as they spooled up to operational power. The aircraft shuddered slightly as systems came online, and she felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded every combat mission. Tower clearance came through her headset with crisp professionalism, but she could hear the underlying tension in the controller's voice. Everyone on base knew this was a high-risk mission into heavily contested airspace. As she taxied toward the runway, Sarah reviewed the mission parameters one final time. Her target area was approximately 200 miles northeast, deep in jungle territory where the thick canopy provided excellent concealment for enemy forces. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, with storm clouds building over the mountains and visibility dropping by the hour. The takeoff was smooth and powerful, the A-10's engines providing more than adequate thrust to lift the heavily loaded aircraft into the humid morning air. As she climbed through the scattered clouds, Sarah could see the vast expanse of jungle stretching to the horizon, an endless green carpet broken only by the occasional river or clearing. Somewhere below that canopy, soldiers might be fighting for their lives, depending on her ability to find them and provide the firepower needed for their survival. Navigation to the target area required careful attention to both electronic systems and visual landmarks. The GPS coordinates provided only a general location for the missing convoy, and finding the actual site would require sharp eyes and patience. Sarah flew at medium altitude to conserve fuel while maintaining the ability to respond quickly to any ground contact. The radio crackled occasionally with distant transmissions from other aircraft and ground units, but her assigned frequency remained ominously quiet. As she approached the suspected area, Sarah began her descent, trading altitude for a better view of the terrain below. The jungle canopy was thicker than she had expected, with only occasional breaks that provided glimpses of the ground beneath. The road that the convoy had been traveling was barely visible as a thin brown line winding through the green expanse. She activated her targeting systems and began a systematic search pattern, flying back and forth across the area while scanning for any signs of the missing vehicles. The first indication of trouble came from her radar warning receiver, an electronic chirping that indicated she was being tracked by enemy radar. Sarah immediately began evasive maneuvers, using the terrain and her aircraft's relatively small radar signature to break the lock. The sound meant that somewhere below, hostile forces were actively searching for her aircraft with surface-to-air missile systems. She had entered a deadly game of cat and mouse, where a moment's inattention could result in a missile streaking toward her aircraft at supersonic speed. Banking hard to the left, Sarah spotted something that made her heart race. Partially concealed beneath the jungle canopy, she could make out the distinctive shape of military vehicles. But, as she moved closer for a better look, she realized with growing alarm that this was not the missing convoy. The vehicles below were enemy tanks and armored personnel carriers, arranged in a defensive position that suggested a major military installation. She had stumbled into something far larger and more dangerous than a simple convoy ambush. The radio suddenly crackled to life with an urgent transmission. A weak, static-filled voice struggled to break through the interference, calling for immediate assistance. The transmission was brief and broken, but Sarah caught enough to understand that American forces were under heavy attack somewhere nearby. Her pulse quickened as she realized that her solo mission had just become something entirely different. She was no longer searching for a missing convoy, she was about to become the only air support for troops in desperate need of help. Sarah banked her aircraft toward the direction of the transmission, pushing the throttles forward to increase speed. Below her, the jungle seemed to come alive with hostile activity. Muzzle flashes sparkled like deadly fireflies among the trees, and smoke columns rose from multiple locations. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and she found herself flying alone into what appeared to be a full-scale battle. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a physical burden as she realized that lives hung in the balance, and she was their only hope for survival. The radio transmission grew stronger as Sarah approached the source, and the desperation in the voice became unmistakable. Staff Sergeant David Chen, a forward air controller attached to a special operations team, was calling for immediate close air support. His unit had been conducting a reconnaissance mission when they stumbled into a heavily fortified enemy position. Now they were pinned down in a small clearing, surrounded by hostile forces and running low on ammunition. The enemy had them completely surrounded, and conventional ground support was hours away. Sarah's training kicked in as she established radio contact with Sergeant Chen. Her voice remained calm and professional despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She requested detailed information about friendly positions, enemy locations, and the tactical situation on the ground. Chen's responses were quick and precise, painting a picture of a desperate fight for survival. His team of 12 soldiers was trapped in a depression near a small stream, with enemy positions in a horseshoe formation around their location. The challenge facing Sarah was immense. The enemy forces were well concealed beneath the thick jungle canopy, making visual identification nearly impossible. Traditional tactics called for multiple attack runs from different angles, but flying alone meant she would have to coordinate everything herself while maintaining constant communication with the ground forces. Any mistake could result in friendly fire casualties, a pilot's worst nightmare that haunted every close air support mission. Circling at a safe altitude, Sarah began her target identification process. She used her aircraft's sophisticated targeting systems to scan the jungle below, looking for heat signatures and movement patterns that would reveal enemy positions. The infrared sensors picked up multiple hotspots, but distinguishing between friendly and hostile forces required careful analysis and constant communication with the ground team. Chen guided her attention to specific areas where enemy fire was heaviest, painting targets with his laser designator when possible. The first attack run required nerves of steel and precise timing. Sarah rolled her A-10 into a steep dive, lining up her approach to strike an enemy machine gun position that was pouring deadly fire into the trapped soldier's location. The jungle rushed up toward her as she descended, and she could see muzzle flashes winking among the trees like deadly stars. At the last possible moment, she squeezed the trigger, and the GAU-8 cannon roared to life with its distinctive sound, like the world's largest chainsaw cutting through metal. 30mm rounds tore through the jungle canopy at incredible velocity, shredding trees and vegetation as they sought their targets below. Sarah pulled up sharply from her dive, feeling the G-forces press her deep into her ejection seat as she climbed away from the target area. Behind her, explosions echoed through the jungle as her rounds found their mark. Chen's excited voice confirmed the hit, reporting that the enemy machine gun position had been silenced and his team could now move to better cover. But the reprieve was temporary. As Sarah climbed for altitude to set up her next attack run, her radar warning receiver screamed an urgent warning. Multiple surface-to-air missile sites had locked onto her aircraft, and launch indicators showed that deadly missiles were already in the air. Sarah threw her A-10 into violent evasive maneuvers, dropping chaff and flares while diving toward the relative safety of the jungle canopy. The missiles streaked past her aircraft, their proximity close enough that she could feel the shock waves. The cat and mouse game had become deadly serious. Sarah realized that the enemy had been waiting for her to reveal herself, using the trapped soldiers as bait to draw aircraft into their missile envelope. Every time she climbed to attack altitude, she became vulnerable to the sophisticated air defense network that surrounded the area. She would have to find a way to neutralize the missile sites while continuing to provide support to the ground forces, all while flying alone against overwhelming odds. Banking low over the jungle canopy, Sarah spotted the telltale signature of a mobile missile launcher moving between concealed positions. The vehicle was trying to relocate after its failed shot, but its movement made it visible to her infrared sensors. She immediately rolled into an attack dive, this time approaching from an unexpected angle that would minimize her exposure to other defensive positions. The Maverick missile she launched streaked toward its target with deadly accuracy, guided by the aircraft's sophisticated fire control systems. The explosion that followed was spectacular, a pillar of fire and smoke that rose above the jungle canopy as the missile launcher was destroyed. Secondary explosions indicated that she had hit an ammunition storage area, and the destruction of the mobile launcher would temporarily reduce the air defense threat. But there were other missile sites still active, and Sarah knew that her luck could not hold forever against such concentrated defenses. Chen's voice came through the radio again, reporting that enemy forces were massing for a final assault on his position. Time was running out for the surrounded soldiers, and conventional reinforcements were still hours away. Sarah found herself facing an impossible choice. She could attempt to silence all the missile sites systematically, which would take time the ground forces did not have, or she could risk everything on a series of low-level attacks that would keep her below the missile engagement envelope but expose her to intense ground fire. The decision came naturally to her, born from months of combat experience and an unwavering commitment to the soldiers she was sworn to protect. Sarah pushed her throttles forward and dove toward the jungle canopy, beginning a series of low-level attack runs that would test both her flying skills and her aircraft's legendary durability. Flying barely above the treetops, she began systematically engaging enemy positions with cannon fire and precision weapons, accepting the risk of ground fire in exchange for the ability to provide continuous support. The A-10's titanium armor proved its worth as small arms fire rattled off the aircraft's protective shell. Sarah could hear the impacts against her aircraft, but the Warthog's legendary toughness allowed her to continue fighting even while taking damage. She pressed home attack after attack, working methodically around the perimeter of the enemy positions while Chen coordinated the strikes from the ground. Each pass brought her closer to the concentrated enemy fire, but also brought the trapped soldiers closer to rescue. During one particularly aggressive attack run, Sarah's aircraft took a direct hit from a rocket-propelled grenade that exploded near her left engine. The A-10 shuddered from the impact, and warning lights illuminated across her instrument panel. Engine temperature spiked, and she could see fuel streaming from damaged lines. But the aircraft continued to fly, its redundant systems and rugged construction allowing her to maintain control even with significant battle damage. The situation was becoming critical for both the pilot and the ground forces. Sarah's aircraft was wounded and burning fuel at an alarming rate, while below, Chen reported that enemy forces were beginning their final assault. The trapped soldiers were down to their last magazines of ammunition, and, without continued air support, they would be overrun within minutes. Everything depended on Sarah's ability to keep fighting despite her damaged aircraft and the increasingly desperate tactical situation. With her fuel supply dwindling and her aircraft trailing smoke, Sarah made the decision that would define her military career. Instead of withdrawing to a safe distance to assess her damage, she committed to one final, devastating attack that would either save the ground forces or result in the loss of both pilot and aircraft. She armed her remaining cluster bombs and lined up for a final approach that would take her directly through the heart of the enemy's defensive positions. The jungle seemed to erupt with hostile fire as every enemy weapon in the area focused on her damaged aircraft. Tracer rounds streaked past her canopy like deadly meteors, and explosions bracketed her flight path as the enemy threw everything they had at the attacking A-10. Sarah held her course with grim determination, knowing that the lives of 12 soldiers depended on her ability to complete this final attack run despite the overwhelming enemy fire. The cluster bombs released from Sarah's aircraft with mechanical precision, tumbling through the humid air before deploying their deadly submunitions over the enemy positions. The resulting explosions created a devastating pattern of destruction that swept through the jungle like a steel hurricane. Trees splintered and fell as hundreds of individual bomblets detonated among the enemy forces, effectively breaking their coordinated assault on the trapped soldiers. The overwhelming firepower of the cluster weapons had bought precious time, but Sarah's problems were far from over. Her damaged A-10 was now trailing a thick plume of black smoke from the wounded engine, and the cockpit was beginning to fill with acrid fumes that made breathing difficult. Multiple warning systems were demanding her attention, but she forced herself to focus on the immediate tactical situation. Chen's excited voice confirmed that the enemy assault had been broken, with hostile forces retreating in disarray from the devastating airstrike. However, her fuel situation was becoming critical, and the nearest friendly airfield was still over an hour away. Flying low over the jungle canopy, Sarah assessed her aircraft's condition while maintaining communication with the ground forces. The left engine was running rough and losing power, forcing her to compensate with increased throttle on the right engine. This imbalance was consuming fuel at an alarming rate, and she calculated that she might not have enough remaining to reach base. The hydraulic system was also showing signs of damage, making the aircraft sluggish to respond to control inputs. Chen reported that his team was beginning to move toward a cleared area where helicopter extraction might be possible, but enemy forces were regrouping for another assault. Small groups of hostile fighters were emerging from concealed positions, apparently trying to cut off the soldiers' escape route. Sarah realized that her mission was not complete. The ground forces would need continued air support to reach the extraction point safely. Despite her aircraft's deteriorating condition, Sarah committed to providing overwatch for the withdrawing soldiers. She climbed to a higher altitude to conserve fuel and extend her loiter time over the area. From this vantage point, she could observe enemy movement patterns and coordinate with Chen to guide the soldiers along the safest route. Her targeting systems remained functional despite the battle damage, allowing her to maintain situational awareness of the tactical picture below. The enemy forces proved to be more organized than initially assessed. As the American soldiers moved through the jungle toward the extraction point, hostile units began coordinating their movements to establish ambush positions along the escape route. Sarah spotted these preparations and immediately dove to attack, using precision cannon fire to disrupt the enemy's plans. Each attack run was carefully calculated to minimize fuel consumption while maximizing tactical effect. During one of these supporting attacks, Sarah's aircraft took additional damage from concentrated small arms fire. A burst of automatic weapons fire shattered part of her canopy, sending plexiglass fragments into the cockpit and creating a spider web of cracks that obscured her vision. The sudden decompression and wind noise made communication more difficult, but she pressed on with grim determination. The soldiers below were depending on her, and she would not abandon them regardless of the personal cost. Chen's voice came through the damaged radio system, reporting that his team was approaching the extraction zone but was taking heavy fire from a concealed enemy position. The hostile fighters had established themselves in a series of connected bunkers that commanded the entire clearing, making helicopter extraction impossible until the position was neutralized. Sarah could see the muzzle flashes from the enemy weapons, but the target was partially concealed by dense vegetation and difficult to engage effectively. The tactical situation required a precision strike that would eliminate the enemy position without endangering the nearby friendly forces. Sarah armed her last Maverick missile and began a careful approach that would allow her to engage the target from an optimal angle. The missile's sophisticated guidance system would provide the accuracy needed for such a delicate mission, but she would have only one chance to get it right. A miss would leave the soldiers trapped and her aircraft out of precision weapons. Lining up her approach, Sarah fought the damaged aircraft's tendency to pull to the left as the wounded engine continued to lose power. The targeting system locked onto the enemy bunker complex, and she squeezed the missile release trigger. The Maverick streaked away from her aircraft, its rocket motor leaving a thin trail of smoke as it guided itself toward the target. Sarah pulled away from the attack run, watching the missile's progress on her targeting display while preparing for possible evasive maneuvers. The missile impact was devastating and precise, striking the center of the enemy bunker complex and triggering a series of secondary explosions that indicated a significant ammunition storage area. The entire position disappeared in a massive fireball that sent debris flying hundreds of feet into the air. Chen's excited confirmation came through the radio immediately. The enemy position had been completely destroyed, and the extraction zone was now secure for helicopter operations. But Sarah's relief was short-lived as her aircraft's condition continued to deteriorate. The right engine, which had been compensating for the damaged left engine, began showing signs of stress from the extended high-power operation. Engine temperature was climbing into the red zone, and she could see metal particles in the exhaust stream. The hydraulic system was also failing progressively, making the aircraft increasingly difficult to control. She was running out of time and options. Emergency fuel calculations showed that she might be able to reach a friendly forward operating base, but only if she climbed to maximum efficiency altitude and reduced power to minimum sustainable levels. This would leave her vulnerable to any remaining enemy air defenses, but staying low would guarantee fuel exhaustion before reaching friendly territory. The decision was made more difficult by the fact that Chen's team was still waiting for helicopter extraction, and she wanted to remain available to provide support if needed. Chen's voice resolved her dilemma when he reported that rescue helicopters were inbound and would arrive at the extraction zone within minutes. His team had reached the cleared area safely and established a defensive perimeter while waiting for pickup. Sarah's mission was essentially complete. She had successfully protected the ground forces and enabled their extraction. Now she needed to focus on getting her damaged aircraft home safely. Climbing to altitude for the long flight back to base, Sarah felt the accumulated stress of the combat mission settling over her like a heavy blanket. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the worst of the fighting was beginning to fade, replaced by the grinding fatigue that came with flying a severely damaged aircraft over hostile territory. Every warning light and alarm in the cockpit demanded attention, but she forced herself to prioritize the most critical systems. The flight back toward friendly territory was a constant struggle against the aircraft's increasing mechanical problems. The left engine finally seized completely, forcing her to shut it down and configure for single-engine flight. This reduced her speed and rate of climb significantly, while also making the aircraft much more difficult to control. The hydraulic system was operating on emergency backup power, providing minimal control authority that required constant attention to maintain level flight. As she crossed into friendly airspace, Sarah attempted to contact her home base to declare an emergency and request priority landing clearance. The radio system, damaged during the earlier combat, was functioning intermittently and producing significant static that made communication difficult. She managed to transmit her aircraft identification and emergency status before the radio failed completely, leaving her alone with a crippled aircraft and no way to communicate with ground control. The forward operating base finally appeared on the horizon, its runway visible as a thin gray line against the green jungle landscape. Sarah began her approach despite having no radio contact and minimal control authority. The emergency landing would test both her flying skills and her aircraft's legendary durability one final time. Below her, she could see emergency vehicles positioning themselves along the runway, their crews preparing for what might be a catastrophic arrival. The approach to the runway required every ounce of Sarah's flying experience and skill. With only one functioning engine and minimal hydraulic pressure, the A-10 wanted to roll and yaw uncontrollably. She fought the aircraft constantly, using rudder and aileron inputs to maintain something resembling stable flight. The damaged canopy created additional aerodynamic problems, with irregular airflow causing vibrations throughout the aircraft structure that made precise control nearly impossible. Emergency vehicles lined both sides of the runway as Sarah's wounded aircraft descended toward the airfield. Fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue personnel were positioned at strategic intervals, their crews ready to respond to whatever emergency might develop during the landing attempt. The tower had lost radio contact with her aircraft, but the visual approach was clear, a smoking A-10 trailing fuel vapor and flying an unstable pattern that indicated serious mechanical problems. Sarah lowered the landing gear manually using the emergency extension system, as the normal hydraulic controls had failed completely. The gear doors remained partially open, creating additional drag that she compensated for by increasing power on the remaining engine. Every control input required careful consideration, as overcorrecting could easily result in a complete loss of control at this low altitude and speed. The runway grew larger in her cracked windscreen as she descended through the final 100 feet. The touchdown was harder than normal but controlled, with the main gear striking the runway surface before the aircraft settled into a stable configuration. Sarah immediately deployed the drag chute and applied wheel brakes, both of which functioned normally despite the extensive battle damage. The A-10 rolled down the runway trailing smoke and leaking various fluids, but maintaining directional control as it gradually slowed to taxi speed. Emergency vehicles followed alongside, ready to respond if fire or other problems developed. As her aircraft finally came to a stop, Sarah sat motionless for several moments, allowing the reality of her survival to sink in. The cockpit was filled with smoke and the acrid smell of damaged electrical systems, but she was alive and on friendly territory. Through her cracked canopy, she could see rescue personnel approaching with fire extinguishers and medical equipment. The mission had been completed successfully, but the cost in terms of aircraft damage and personal stress was enormous. Ground crews immediately began assessing the battle damage while medical personnel helped Sarah exit the aircraft. Her legs were unsteady as she climbed down from the cockpit, the accumulated fatigue and stress of the mission finally taking their toll. The A-10 behind her was a testament to the aircraft's legendary toughness, riddled with bullet holes, missing sections of engine cowling, and trailing smoke from multiple damaged systems, but it had brought her home safely. The intelligence debrief took several hours as Sarah provided detailed information about enemy positions, defensive capabilities, and tactical procedures observed during the mission. Her observations would prove valuable for future operations in the area, and the successful rescue of the ground forces had prevented a potential international incident. Military analysts were particularly interested in the sophisticated air defense network she had encountered, as it indicated a significant escalation in enemy capabilities. News of the successful mission spread quickly through the base and beyond. Sarah had single-handedly engaged a heavily defended enemy position, provided critical close air support that saved 12 soldiers' lives, and returned with valuable intelligence about enemy capabilities. Her actions had prevented what could have been a devastating loss of life and demonstrated the continued importance of close air support in modern combat operations. The rescued soldiers, Staff Sergeant Chan and his special operations team, were evacuated safely to a medical facility where they received treatment for minor injuries and exhaustion. Chen later provided his own debrief of the mission, emphasizing how Sarah's precise and aggressive attacks had been the decisive factor in their survival. His testimony corroborated the heroic nature of her actions and the professional skill she had demonstrated under extreme pressure. Sarah's damaged A-10 would require extensive repairs before returning to service, but initial assessments suggested that the aircraft could be salvaged. The maintenance crews marveled at the amount of damage the aircraft had sustained while continuing to function. Bullet holes, shrapnel damage, and engine problems that would have been fatal to most aircraft had been absorbed by the A-10's rugged design. The aircraft had lived up to its reputation as the most survivable close air support platform in military service. In the days following the mission, Sarah struggled with the emotional aftermath of her combat experience. The intensity of the aerial engagement and the knowledge that lives had depended on her decisions created a psychological burden that was difficult to process. military psychologists worked with her to address these concerns, helping her understand that such reactions were normal for combat veterans who had experienced high-stress situations. Recognition for her actions came in the form of military decorations and commendations, but Sarah found that the most meaningful acknowledgement came from the soldiers she had saved. Letters and messages from Chan and his team members expressed their gratitude in personal terms that transcended official recognition. These communications helped her understand the broader impact of her actions and the importance of the close air support mission in protecting ground forces. The tactical lessons learned from Sarah's mission were incorporated into training programs and operational procedures throughout the military. Her experience demonstrated the importance of individual initiative, aircraft durability, and precision weapons in close air support operations. The mission became a case study in military academies and pilot training programs, illustrating how a single pilot could influence the outcome of ground combat through professional skill and personal courage. Months later, Sarah returned to flight status with a new appreciation for both the capabilities and limitations of her aircraft and mission. The experience had changed her perspective on combat flying, making her more aware of the human cost of military operations while reinforcing her commitment to protecting ground forces. She understood now that every mission carried the potential for life or death decisions that would be remembered long after the official reports were filed. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, after extensive repairs and modifications, returned to service with enhanced defensive systems and improved communication equipment. The aircraft bore no visible signs of its battle damage, but the maintenance records told the story of a machine that had been pushed to its absolute limits and survived. Sarah often visited the aircraft during its restoration, reflecting on the mission that had tested both pilot and machine in ways that training could never replicate. Years later, as Sarah advanced in her military career, she continued to draw lessons from that desperate mission over the jungle Canopy. The experience had taught her about leadership under pressure, the importance of technical competence, and the bonds that connect military personnel across different services and specialties. She understood that her actions that day had been part of a larger tradition of military service that valued courage, skill, and selfless dedication to protecting others. The jungle where the mission took place eventually returned to its natural state, with no visible signs of the intense combat that had occurred among its trees. But, for Sarah and the soldiers she had saved, the memories remained vivid and meaningful. Their shared experience had created bonds that would last throughout their military careers and beyond, a reminder that in the most challenging circumstances, training, courage, and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Staff Sergeant Chen eventually retired from military service and returned to civilian life, but he maintained contact with Sarah throughout the years. Their correspondence reminded both of them that military service, at its core, was about people protecting people. The sophisticated weapons and advanced technology were merely tools in service of a more fundamental purpose, ensuring that those who served their country could return home safely to their families and communities.